Well, one of the big question marks in this election is just how many young people will actually turn out to cast a ballot. In the last election, that number was about 54% for voters aged 18 to 24, much lower than other age groups. And this year, there are concerns it will be even lower because Elections Canada has canceled the Vote on Campus program at 98 post-secondary institutions across Canada because of the pandemic. That program made it easier for students away from home to cast a ballot. So what will happen to that vote in this campaign? And why is that important? I'm joined by Samantha Reusch, the Executive Director of Apathy's Boring, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works to boost youth citizenship and engagement, and by David Moscrop, a political theorist, author, and columnist. Good to see you both. Thanks for being here. Samantha, if I can, let me start with you. What concerns do you have about the level of voter turnout among young people that we might see in this election?
I think it's an interesting question because, as you mentioned, the on-campus polling, of course, is a great tool to help students overcome some of the barriers that they face, especially students that are living away from home. But there were lots of other options for them to cast ballots in this election. Part of the work we've been doing is ensuring that they're aware of those options, including the mail-in ballots and voting at Elections Canada offices. But what we've seen coming out of the pandemic that I think is really interesting to underscore is that we did some research back a couple months ago that showed that interest in Canadian politics among young people has actually gone up by about 10 percentage points since 2019. I think a lot of that probably comes back to the pandemic and sort of the conditions that we've been living in over the last 18 months. So ultimately, I think the turnout will depend on the candidates and the party leaders' ability to engage with the priorities that are important to young people and to effectively address them in this campaign.
All right, David, we often talk about the sheer numbers and just trying who's going to turn out, who's not. We sort of reflect on lower turnout in some age groups. Go, that's too bad. But let's dig a little deeper. Why does youth voter turnout matter, especially when you look at the turnout in other groups and what that does to election results and maybe policy choices?
Sure. I mean, there's two things. One is what do we talk about, and and who do we return to Parliament? And the fact is, if we had full turnout, we would expect that the issues we talked about and the way that we talk about them would be different. And if we had full turnout, we'd elect a different Parliament and perhaps even a different government in the long run. And if you look at polls, you see that there is a substantive difference among young people compared to older people when it comes to who they support and what they want to talk about. And there's data on this. Abacus data has some stuff on this that's quite good, that the concerns vary. And so the question is, okay, well, what do we do then if we've got a turnout spread of 20 points between the youngest group and the second oldest group, right? How do we make sure that the agenda is set in such a way that it's substantively speaks to these young folks that aren't turning out? And how do we ensure that the parliament that we have in this country is made up of the people that the country as a whole want? And instead, we've gotten to this negative cycle where we say, well, young people don't vote, so parties aren't going to spend their limited resources pulling them to the polls. Young people don't vote, so we're not going to speak to their issues as much because we're going to speak to the issues that likely voters want to have spoken to, or that we're going to pass legislation and policies that respect the interests and the wishes and the preferences of those who turn out. And then, of course, the more you do that, the less likely young people are going to be to turn out because they feel alienated from the system.
Right.
And so we end up with a country that isn't representative of the folks on the street.
Sam, do you want to weigh in on that? I mean, because the two things are not always completely separate, right? I mean, there's a lot of cross-pollination, as it were, between the different age groups about, and maybe more so in this campaign than some others, affordability issues. They touch a lot of different voter age groups, climate change. Follow up on David's comments about, I guess, how little we invest in trying to encourage those younger people to vote.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with David. I think ultimately that what we see is that young people don't feel a sense of belonging or a sense of trust within our political system. So when we talk about barriers that young people face, like campus polling locations and all of these things, there's great, but there's a broader systemic issue that we have here around how we view young people as a constituency. So when we hit an election campaign and someone does decide potentially that they want to speak about or address these issues that matter to young people, there's also what happens in between elections. There's also sort of the infrastructure that exists around the campaigns and where their resources are being allocated and how they're talking about these issues. So I think one of the things that young people can do or can think about sort of coming into this election is, yes, okay, will I be having an impact on the outcome of this election? Maybe, maybe not, depending on where you live. But what you can do is sort of over time is shift the narrative around young people or people in your community or where you live and show that you're paying attention and show that you care. And I don't personally believe that we should have to do that. I would love to see us be in a democracy that recognizes all citizens equally. But unfortunately, the way that our system is structured, the way campaigns are structured, and this is where I really agree with David, that's not the case, and it should be.
Right. So what's the way to get around that? I mean, we do have a system that says, and you've talked about it, it all flows together. Parties target the people that they know are going to turn out to vote. That's what the policies tend to be targeted around. So how do you move away from that? How do you move away to a system that says, look, are we saying even if you don't take the time to cast a ballot, we are going to find a way to show that you're represented in the decisions we make? How do we get there? David, go ahead.
Well, I mean, first of all, parties should recognize that young people can be mobilized, and it is in their interest to mobilize them. So there's this sort of elite-led element of look, there are votes lying there sitting there in the street. Go pick them up. Go drag them to the polls. Do you want to create a generation of young voters who are engaged with your party? Put in the work, put in the time, take a chance. My God. The other option is mandatory voting, which I used to oppose, but now support, because not because necessarily it produces better voters, because often it doesn't, but it forces the parties to appeal to everybody instead of their particular niches or their likely voter neighborhoods. So we've got the voluntary or the involuntary. I have a slight preference, in fact, for the involuntary, but at the very least, we deserve parties to be out there hustling, getting young folks out to the polls.
Yeah, Samantha, what are your thoughts on that? Let me start with the mandatory voting. Is that a realistic option, do you think?
I mean, there are countries who have implemented those measures. Whether or not that will, I mean, obviously there is a degree where that could have an impact on those who turn out, and again, how the parties approach the citizens. But I also think it's a question of values. If we are a democracy and we value having a democracy, and long term we want to make sure that our democracy is thriving and robust, we have to engage younger voters. We have to take an equity approach to the people who are not turning out and really ask ourselves these deep questions of why they don't feel that their vote matters or that they have value within that system. And I think if democracy is our North Star and we really approach it in that way, I think what we have to do is address the gaps that currently exist and really focus on engaging especially those people who don't turn out, and not just looking at our immediate base or the people who have reliably done so. And it's really a question of what we want our country to look like in the future, and how we're going to get there, I think, is through engaging those voters.
Right. David, some people would argue that there are advantages to some political parties to not engage young people, to know exactly where the vote's coming from and know, and tailor your campaigns and your policies that way, because as we've sort of touched on, you can invest a lot of time as a party, and sometimes you don't even invest time. We've seen some organic campaigns in the last couple of elections where young people came to a party because of the messaging, because of the candidate. But for some parties, there's no advantage in pursuing a youth vote. Tell me about that.
Yeah. They've given up. They've effectively said, this is not our path to power, therefore we won't. I mean, and this is what I was talking about before, is that the fact is that there are two parties that young people are more likely to vote for, the Liberals and the New Democrats, and one party that they're less likely to vote for, and that's the Conservatives. That doesn't mean the Conservatives can't persuade young people. If they want to try to go after the youth vote, they can. But if they choose not to, then that's their disadvantage. We saw in 2015 that a huge part of the Liberal Party win, and their majority, incidentally, was young voters who were turning out because they were taken in by Justin Trudeau, by the promise of cannabis, by the promise of electoral reform, by the promise of doing politics differently with Indigenous peoples. And that was a huge part of the Liberal win. It eludes me that the Liberals wouldn't want to go back to that well. It seems like they're not entirely committed to. the NDP enjoys high support among young people, but can't get them out to the polls. And so the other element of this is, okay, once the parties have reached out, how much of the get out the vote is actually going into mobilizing them? And quite frankly, there is a party that's putting more effort into this than others, and it's the New Democrats. Of course, they're doing that because it benefits them politically, because they have a lot of supporters there. Right. But what we would love to see is an effort across parties to court young folks, rather than assuming that they're just inherently partisan leftists and therefore not worthy of their attention.
Samantha, Elections Canada says, look, the vote on campus program wasn't everything, but it certainly contributed to boosting voter turnout to some degree, because it made it that much easier. But Elections Canada said, look, there was too much uncertainty around the timing of a minority parliament. There's the pandemic, uncertainty about whether there'll be in-class teaching again on campus, so no ability to organize all of this in time for the election. Do you accept those reasons from Elections Canada, and could there have been an alternative? I know there's mail-in voting, but is there something else that could have been specifically targeted at youth voters?
Look, as someone who's working in this context right now, I can kind of understand and empathize how uncertain with the minority government, but also with the pandemic, things have been. We've had to modify a lot of our programming personally. So like I said, I understand. It's disappointing for sure. But I also, like I said before, we've just been really focused on the alternatives, on mail-in ballots, on voting in Elections Canada office. The great thing about the on-campus polling locations is that they're really convenient, first of all, of course. So if you have someone who's sort of on the fence and it's right there in their face, it's great. But otherwise, it can also complement on-campus voter engagement. And with the timing of this election, I understand how that's complicated. And I'm hopeful that they'll bring it back next time. But I'm also confident that we've been able to reach a large number of young people, so have campuses, in order to explain what the options are and still encourage those young people.
Well, I guess we'll know what we see after voting. But David, let me just finish on this too in the little bit of time we have left. And I guess it's a question of where the focus needs to be pointed. It's one thing for a Crown agency or a non-governmental agency like Elections Canada to be part of the outreach and encouragement, but should we really be relying on them to make this happen, or is it back to this issue around political parties and engagement and mobilization?
It's all hands on deck. It's absolutely all hands on deck. I mean, everybody should be doing everything they can to ensure that we have an equitable distribution of voters, and that every voting group, not just age, but gender, ethnicity, so forth, is represented properly in the electoral system, so that we get a parliament and an issue agenda that looks and thinks like the country. And so Elections Canada is absolutely critical to that. They need to be ready for this, because you can have a snap election under majority governments too, by the way. We remember the Chrétien years. Yeah. But yeah, parties have to do that work too. Advocacy organizations, Apathy is Boring is a great example, are out there doing that, but it has to be all hands on deck, because absent mandatory voting, and even to some degree with it, nobody can do this on their own. All
right. Listen, thank you both for your time tonight, and we'll see what the results give us on Election Day after Monday, and hopefully that youth voter turnout is on the way back up. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.